Hi, I'm Ryan. I'm on the Geocortex Workflow development team. Today, I'd like to show you how to query a SQL database in Geocortex Workflow 5. Let's take a look. I have a workflow here, and it's really simple. It has a display form activity, and it has a drop-down list asking to pick or select a customer from a list. Now, this list at the moment is just a hard-coded list of options, but I would like this list to be populated from a database. And this is something that we can normally do through an ArcGIS query or something like that, but that's using an ArcGIS REST API to perform that query. If we want to go direct to the database, that's something that it hasn't been possible until today inside Workflow. And we're going to use a new feature called server workflows that are available in Workflow 5.8 in the on-premises version of Workflow. And what this is going to allow us to do is create a whole new type of workflow that's going to run on the server, and it's going to do our work to actually query the database for us. It'll have access to activities that can query the database, and then it'll return us some results so that my client workflow, the workflow the end user is interacting with, can basically call the server workflow as if it were a web service. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a brand new workflow. And this is going to be my server workflow, and I'm actually going to tell it that it's a server workflow by switching to the info panel and selecting server workflow. This is going to change the toolbox to have a different set of activities that are available, and some of the really powerful ones here are the SQL query activities. So the SQL query activity, it's kind of the connection type, name, connection string, that sort of information. It's going to allow me to define my query. I've set one up in advance here, so I'm just going to populate the provider. This is going to be a SQL Server database. I'm going to plug in a connection string. This is just some database that's sitting on the internet that we can use. And I'll quickly show you this table. So it's just a Microsoft Northwind database. It's got a customers table, and it's got, if I select all those records, there's a contact name field, and this field is what I want to populate my results with. So I'm going to run this query. And this is going to provide a data table output. And what I want is I want this server workflow, it's kind of acting as a web service. I want it to provide that data table as the output to the workflow itself. And there's an activity called set workflow output. And I can provide whatever name I like for this output. So I'm going to call it contacts. And the value is going to be SQL query 1.datatable. So just the result of that data table. Now, when I save this, I'm going to call this customer server workflow. Okay, so my server side part is done. It's going to do a query and it's going to return that data table as a JSON data structure to this client workflow. And the client workflow, rather than using this manual list of options in that dropdown, I'm going to change to use a sub workflow, and I'm just going to start with a blank one. Now, in this, when we're populating this, I want to run that server workflow. So there's a run workflow activity. And I need to give it a URL. So if I go back to my server workflow on the info panel, I can copy the URL, paste that in. That workflow didn't have any inputs or arguments, so I don't need to supply any, but it's going to provide a result. And then what I want to do is I want to take that result, which will have a data table on it, and I need to convert that data table into something that the form is going to be able to use. And there's an activity called get form element items from collection, which will do that. So the collection in this case is going to be my run workflow 1 result, and contacts was the name of the property that I assigned on that. So we're going to take that contacts collection, and it's just a JSON data structure. So the contact name field will be represented as contact name, and I'm going to just, for both the name and value of that drop-down list, I'm going to use the same field. And the last thing we need to do here is set form element items. So we have to actually tell the drop-down list to use these items. Form element 1.items. And if I save that, we should be able to run that. And I'll just run this in the sandbox. And there we go. I've got my list. It's coming from the database. And if I pick a value and submit it, the remainder of my workflow was just to alert that value back, but we could now go on and do something really useful with that. So there you have it. We're able to create a client workflow. So that's running in the web browser. It calls a server workflow when it needs to do something server specific, like do a SQL database query or send an email or some kind of server processing. That server workflow returns a data structure to the client, and then the client is able to use that and carry on with that workflow. So that's how you do it. You can query SQL database inside Workflow 5.